Good morning, and thank you all for coming out today. As Nick mentioned, I work for a major U.S. company. We manufacture in 25 countries around the world, and we trade in enormous volumes of commodities, of parts, of automobiles. And so when I look at this trade issue, I approach it from more from the viewpoint of a practitioner than an ideologue or a philosopher. And I think too much of our trade debate here in Washington, D.C. is actually about philosophy and ideology, and quite honestly, not enough of it is about simply the practice of trade. If you reduce it to its simplest form, trade is the movement of goods and services across borders. If you want free trade, you're achieving a less constrained movement of goods and services across borders. It's relatively simple, and yet we find ourselves in these confounding and poisonous political debates in Washington that we see manifesting themselves even today across our institutions of government. So, like many of you, I was stunned in watching one of the candidates from a major political party running for the presidency of the United States not only denounce the North American Free Trade Agreement, but actually threatened to withdraw from it outright. Like many of you, I was surprised when then Senator Obama said that, and I was equally surprised when then Senator Clinton endorsed it, this being in the 2008 campaign in the primaries in the debate in Cleveland, moderated by Tim Russert. Yes, it was that presidential candidate that proposed to withdraw from NAFTA within 6 months if the Mexicans and Canadians didn't agree to comprehensively renegotiate the treaty. Now, I think many thought that was empty rhetoric, and in fact it was, although to his credit, President Obama in office sought to make some improvements in NAFTA in the course of the TransPacific Partnership Agreement, but still it underlines the fact that the political expedience of attacking free trade agreements predates the Trump administration by a long time. It's interesting to study the politics of trade. The Pew Charitable Trust does an enormous amount of polling on these issues, and they found some fairly interesting results in a poll last year. One is that 67% of self-identified Democratic voters believe that free trade agreements make America stronger. Interestingly, 36% of Republican voters endorse free trade agreements as making the United States stronger. The politics are confounding here because it's an article of faith in Washington, D.C., certainly inside the Beltway, that free trade agreements will not pass the United States Congress unless they gain the support of every single Republican member and a small handful of Democratic members of Congress willing to support for free trade agreements. Yet each of those parties is out of step with their own political base. In fact, the only major political figure who is in step with their political base is President Trump. Among self-identified Trump voters, 27% believe that free trade agreements are good for America. But President Trump not only is speaking with and for his political base, but he's actually in greater synergy and greater harmony with the American public as well. Of all the issues that have generated controversy among establishment political and foreign policy leaders, free trade may be one of the biggest, and yet it's the one where the president really does reflect, to a significant degree, the sentiment of the country. I was asked in the course of this Aspen project that we did this summer, and you'll see it in a chapter in the book, to try to do a bit of a diagnostic and analyze why this is and perhaps forecast some steps forward. Let me just very quickly say on TransPacific Partnership, I understand the distress it's caused many and the confusion it's caused in Asia Pacific about America's role in the world and what role America will play in the Asia Pacific. But I have to say that agreement didn't die January 23rd of this year when President Trump signed an executive order to withdraw the United States from the agreement. That agreement died a year earlier when it was signed. It did not have the support of the Congress. It did not have the support of the American public, and it most definitely didn't have the unified support of the business community. I can attest to that. That agreement was too big, it was too ambitious, and the return was too small to justify locking into place the status quo, which is largely what it did in U.S. economic relations in Asia Pacific. And it fell victim to primarily a geopolitical aim. One of the things that I've learned since I left government and came into the private sector 15 years ago is that geopolitics makes for really lousy free trade agreements. But good free trade agreements make for great geopolitics. You've got to get the economics right first. If you simply paper over deep differences and competing views on trade, in order to get to yes on an agreement, you are embedding in U.S. relations with major trading partners the tensions that will ultimately culminate in a manner that we're seeing today, whether it's China's WTO membership, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, or many of the other issues of controversy. On NAFTA, it's a different take. In NAFTA, the challenge, quite simply, is that the economics don't work for the United States in terms of producing a trade balance that would excite political support in the United States. I would argue that NAFTA actually works quite well in making the United States far more competitive in building economic and political unity across the North American space. But it's indisputable that we have more than a $60 billion annual trade deficit with Mexico. And this is what President Trump is focused on, is trade deficits. Now, the problem with fixing NAFTA is that you cannot fix a $60+ billion trade deficit by growing U.S. exports to Mexico. As beneficial as I believe NAFTA is, the reality is that the economics will prevent us from balancing trade with Mexico on the revenue side. And so the only tool available to fix the perceived problems of NAFTA are going to be trade limiting, which is antithetical to a free trade agreement. So I have a fairly gloomy expectation of the ability of the U.S. Trade Representative to truly achieve the goal that they want in NAFTA, which is to balance out U.S. trade. There's many economists who would argue that, in fact, trade surpluses and trade deficits are not indicators of the quality of a free trade agreement, and I tend to completely endorse that point of view. However, I would say, just as a caveat, but large trade deficits may indicate problems in a trading relationship as well, and that's what I think we see with many of our Asia-Pacific trading partners. Let me finish by, in the interest of time, by just highlighting very briefly the 10 steps that I think that we should consider as we look forward in trade and how to take the trade agenda forward in a constructive way. And let me say I completely agree with Senator Sullivan's point of view that this is a holistic picture. It's not just about trade. It's about regulation. It's about tax reform. And certainly it's about growth. In fact, as I posit in my paper, I have to believe that a couple of quarters or much less a full year of 4% economic growth will go a long way towards ameliorating a lot of the tensions in the trade debate. But we don't have that yet, and we have to deal with the trade issues now. Ironically, incidentally, that kind of growth will probably balloon our trade deficit, but will also at the same time treat the dissatisfaction in the public that's produced this poisonous political environment. So very quickly, my 10 priorities for our trade debate. First, the who. You have to pick the right partners. We should be engaging with partners who agree and support free trade at the same level we do. This was the original premise of the TransPacific Partnership, to tie together a handful of countries that all had a very high level of support for free trade. But in the course of the geopolitical ambitions of that agreement, we began to bring parties into that agreement who simply don't support free trade by any measure of their records. Second, we should pursue trade agreements with mercantilist powers, but they should be on a bilateral basis so that we can more effectively focus on the challenges in those particular economies, and we can craft the necessary tools in order to force open those economies. Multilaterals are for free trade partners, bilaterals are for mercantilists. Third, let me give you the what's. We should be addressing currency manipulation, which according to the Peterson Institute is adding between $250 and $500 billion to the American trade deficit on an annual basis, and yet heretofore has not been addressed by trade negotiators. Competition, or what we would know as antitrust policy. Corruption, a big issue that undermines comparable comparative advantage in free trade. We have to use the tools of anti-corruption, and we have to tie that to our trade agreement. Regulation, harmonizing global regulation removes the cover that countries use to put non-tariff barriers in place. And then enforcement, enforcement, enforcement. Finally, the how. First, our trade negotiations unfortunately generate a lot of skepticism among the public and among critics. And while there are some consultative tools, we need to do better. There are some ideas on Capitol Hill, such as requiring each negotiating session to be shared in detail with members of Congress. One that is a bit of a stretch, but I like, is doing free trade negotiations in public. It would completely dismiss the notion that anything is being hidden here. I actually think the reason why negotiators meet in private in free trade negotiations is because they are advocating positions that are relatively indefensible in the public. Put it out in the open. It's the easiest way to get support. I think we have to trust the market. Where we have a free trade partner that's not, or trade partner that's not willing to really embrace the model of free trade, we can wait them out. Give them some time. I wish I had $1 for every time I heard that in the long run, mercantilist policies will not be to the benefit of another country. In the long run, they won't be able to sustain that. It'll be a competitive disadvantage for them. Let's play for the long run. If a country is unwilling to make the necessary steps to open its economy to the free trade of goods and services, then it's okay to say no. And finally, as I said a moment ago, geopolitics have to be subordinate to the economics. Free trade has to be driven by the economics first, and the geopolitics have to follow. So that's it, Nick. And if you want to do questions or Richard go, happy either way.
Thank you.
Sure.